Hello, my name is Will Wadlington. I'm welcoming you today to our symposium on presence, becoming, and self-creation in existential psychotherapy. I want to thank Division 32 for sponsoring this symposium, and I want to share with you the plan for today. Speakers today include Eric Craig, Evgenia Georganda, myself, and our discussant is Kirk Schneider. This is one of the latest contributions to the literature on existential therapy. There have been several international conferences in recent years in London, Buenos Aires, and the next conference is in Athens. Out of these meetings and joinings, important attempts to describe the field have arisen. 3 of the panelists here today have contributed to this volume in significant ways. Existential therapy used to be a European phenomenon, but now there's a global recognition that existential issues affect everyone on this planet. Our first presenter today is Eric Craig. Eric is a licensed psychologist, author, and independent scholar who practices and teaches his relational form of existential depth psychotherapy in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Several of his articles in The Humanistic Psychologist are classics, and I think he should publish them in book form. Turning things over to you, Eric.
Thank you very much, and thank you for gathering us and seeing us through all the complications and nuances and newness of an APA Congress where we're not all together in some wonderful city in America. And it's been very challenging for all of us and for you, and I'm so glad we ended up sticking through it, largely due to your persistence. So thank you so much. I want to talk about presence today, and presence as an aspect, a critical aspect, maybe the most permeating and important aspect of the psychotherapeutic relationship. There may be one thing that comes before presence, and that's sanctuary. That is the creation of a space, a time, a setting, and a relationship, including one's own presence, that is both safe and free. Those are the 2 characteristics. And without that sanctuary, presence becomes a vulnerable experience for both therapist and client, because you're entering territories that are quite often never experienced by either person. So I want to really emphasize that sanctuary, the criticalness of that sanctuary. So presence, then, is really in modern research, psychological research, is a part of what are called the common factors research. And the therapist factors are among the most important, but the others, collaboration, alliance, empathy, positive regard, and congruence are all largely dependent on the therapist's contribution. In other words, on the therapist's presence. And by what I mean by presence, very briefly, is simply the being of the therapist. The very being of the therapist, the way of being present. So most of this research, unfortunately, focuses on the technical aspects of psychotherapy. And I'll get into that very shortly. And when we discuss, when I talk about Martin Buber. And I don't think we've put enough emphasis on philosophy. My own analyst and who became a dear friend and teacher, Paul Stern, often said that philosophy was the legal profession of psychology. And we have really lost sight of philosophy, and presence brings us right into the heart of philosophy. The most important things, I think, that can be said about presence are not found in research, though I'm not diminishing the importance of research, but the most important things are in the realm of philosophy. So this is going to be a phenomenological hermeneutic analysis, or an existential analysis of this idea of presence. I'd like to trace some of its history and some of its primary contributors in the world of philosophy as well, that give us a ground for our actual everyday being in the world of psychotherapy. So Søren Kierkegaard talked about the importance of presence. It's critical for him to be entirely present to oneself in self-concern is the highest thing, he wrote. He who is present to himself has what he has to say on hand, in his mouth and in his heart. Has what he has to say on hand, in his mouth and in his heart. Kierkegaard's focus, however, was primarily on presence in relation to God, and an authentic presence in relation to God. It occurs to me, this word authenticity, I only see it in the word congruence, in the common factors in psychotherapy, but authenticity adds something to that notion of congruence, of a matching of kind of self-consistency that Prescott Leckie talked about. But authenticity, I think, is much more, and I wish we had time to explore more that sense, though it will be implicit in a lot of what we talk about. So Martin Buber also talked about presence. And he wrote, these are some of the things that he said about presence. It meant to lay oneself open for what is to be seen or heard or felt by me. It's not enough to be ready. One must also be really there. Each of us, and this is a difficulty that he presents about presence, each of us is encased in an armor which we soon, out of familiarity, no longer notice. And our job as therapists is to take that armor off, as he says, to lay ourselves open in our relationships to our clients. Buber continues in another place, what occurs to me addresses me. In what occurs to me, the world happening addresses me. And in psychotherapy, that's the world happening of that individual's whole existence. What do we expect when we are in despair and yet go to a man or a person, another person? Surely we expect a presence by means of which we are told that nevertheless there is meaning. Genuine responsibility exists only where there is real responding. Each concrete hour allotted to the person, with its content drawn from the world and from destiny, is speech for the man, for the person who is attentive. So there he's going beyond the therapeutic situation that Buber was saying, that the world is constantly speaking to us if we are present, if we are attentive. Now, what is different between Buber and Kierkegaard is that Buber emphasized not presence for oneself alone, as is clear from those quotes, but he wrote that it's important to know your own particular way as a human being. This requires presence, obviously, to yourself, to know your own particular way, and to choose that way, and to begin with yourself. Buber says, begin with yourself. Know your way and begin with yourself. But why? He writes, not for my own sake. This is why the previous injunction was to begin with oneself. To begin with oneself, but not to end with oneself. To start from oneself, but not to aim at oneself. To comprehend oneself, but not to be preoccupied with oneself. So Buber was his whole life was about meeting, was engaging the other, and therefore speaks directly to what we are doing as psychotherapists. So Buber also talked about three kinds of dialogue. One is genuine dialogue. The other is technical dialogue that is aimed at understanding something. And the third is monologue disguised as dialogue. And he gives examples of that, of debate and conversation and friendly chats and lovers' pillow talk. He doesn't use the word pillow. I threw that in. But basically, those are monologues disguised as dialogues. And what we see in modern psychotherapy is mostly technical dialogue. And the research focuses on this. What are the measurable dimensions that we can address that can help us to assure that the patients are at least getting the minimal of what is necessary for a genuine healing or corrective experience? But with all deference to the importance of that research, I'm also interested in the immeasurable aspects of psychotherapy, and presence is one of those, and dialogue is one of those. So this leads us to the fundamental purpose and structure of the therapeutic hour, where two individuals, two human beings, meet for the benefit of the one. And I want to give a quote from an existential philosopher who gave up psychiatry for philosophy, Karl Jaspers. And he writes, the ultimate thing in the therapeutic relationship is existential communication, a community of two selves who live out the possibilities of existence itself as reasonable being. Therapist and patient are both human beings, and as such fellow travelers in destiny. The therapist is not a pure technician, nor pure authority, but existence for its own sake, a transient human creature like the patient. So this leaves us then with the question of what is presence itself? I've talked about how it relates to the the common conditions or core elements, or common elements or contextual elements that are spoken of in the research. But what if we asked about presence itself? I would say, and I keep coming to these two words, I am. The that of human existence. There are three miracles. One is that anything is at all, rather than nothing. The second miracle is that there's such a creature as there has been for the last fairly significant period as human beings. And there will not be human beings again. We will be outlived by other forms of being. So this is a miracle, and it's transient. I have a little prayer I wrote, which underscores this. I built a path to go to the top of a mesa some years ago, 1999. And the prayer is, O Spirit of beginning of Alpha and Eros, of creation and health and love and life, thank you for this gift of being. And, O Spirit of ending, of Omega and Thanatos, of destruction, disease, hatred, and death, thank you for making this gift so precious. And the human being, in many of its manifestations, is a gift. We are at a time today where one wonders how much of a gift human nature is in some of its manifestations. But nevertheless, human beings, being human, the human being is a gift in a sense. It's something actually that the universe made room for at some point. And in my view, we have some obligation to be present to that universe and to nurture it and care for it. So the first miracle is that anything is. The second is that there's such a creature as human beings. There weren't once and there won't be again. And the third miracle is that we are. We are as each individuals. The odds are not even describable mathematically, the chances of our being here. We have a better chance of winning every lottery on the planet every day of our life than to be here. And that's a very low figure in terms of what it really entails. And we too have the gift of being. And we too began like human beings began and will disappear like human beings will disappear. And so that of existence is, for me, one of the most essential things about presence. The knowing of being, the knowing of my own being, the knowing of each human being's being. Now, presence, the term for presence in German is Anwesen, which is a nominalized infinitive, and it's the German for ousia and parousia, thanks to Evgenia for the full translation there. But ousia is the word for being in Greek. And parousia is the word for presence. Heidegger described Anwesen, or ousia, or parousia, to be there, in, at, or involved in something. And he actually described it as an estate or a homestead or a residence or a domain. So to be there is, we're not just there, but we're in the world. This is a world. And when we're in psychotherapy, we have a world that we create uniquely with our clients. And we don't necessarily create it. It creates us in some ways. But it's a whole world. That relationship is a whole world. So these things come from, ultimately, from Plato and Aristotle's discussion of being. So, not sure how we're doing on time here. Has somebody got a heads up on that? So those are two of the most important things that I wanted to say, that presence has to do with being. And we could say a lot about the kinds of presence, that a kind of presence that psychotherapeutic presence is. And Kirk's written a wonderful article that I hadn't known about until late last night on presence in the Journal of Existential Analysis. And if you want to see some of the ways in which presence has been discussed as a concrete, practical, everyday phenomenon, that's a good place to begin. And there's also a wonderful book about presence called Therapeutic Presence. However, this book, as marvelous as it is in some ways, really does not spend much time at all in philosophy. And that's what I've tried to do in very brief terms, offer a corrective or a complement, to the conversation about psychotherapeutic presence. But the real question then is, what kind of presence is required for a presence to be called a therapeutic presence? How is that different from our everyday presence? So thanks again, Will, so much. And thank you, Evgenia and Kirk, for being a part of this as well. And for any of you who are listening and watching this video, I'm so glad you took the time to do that.
Thank you, Eric. Very deep and meaningful presentation. Thank you so much. Our next presenter is Evgenia Georganda, who will speak about becoming, integrating Greek insight and tradition into existential therapy. Evgenia is a certified psychotherapist in private practice in Athens, Greece. She's co-founder, chief administrator, trainer, and supervisor of Becoming, the Hellenic Association for Existential Psychotherapy, a 4-year training program certified as European Accredited Psychotherapy Training Institute for Existential Psychotherapy. In 2013, Evgenia was elected secretary of the National Organization of Psychotherapists of Greece, and in 2019, membership secretary and member of the Board of Trustees of the Federation for Existential Therapy in Europe. Evgenia is speaking to us from Athens, Greece.
Thank you very much, Will, for inviting me to this symposium, and as Eric Craig suggested, for your stamina in organizing it, despite all the difficulties that we had to face with the new way of dealing with this symposium. So it is really my great pleasure and honor to participate for the 3rd year in an APA symposium. Unfortunately, this year, our symposium is a virtual one, depriving us of real face-to-face contact. However, I'm still very grateful that technology is offering us the opportunity to share our thoughts and experiences, even in this more distant manner. In the previous 2 years, I had the opportunity to present the concept of istros, or zest for life, that we at the Hellenic Association for Existential Psychology have explored and written about. Istros is a concept that arose from Greek poetry and literature and is a twin sister of awe, a concept that Dr. Schneider has written about extensively. In modern Greek, it is commonly used when we want to say that someone is in a creative upheaval. Today, I will discuss another important concept that emerged primarily from Greek philosophy, and especially from the writings of Heraclitus. The name of our association is gignaste, which is derived from the Greek verb gignome, and can be translated as I become. However, it is an infinitive and thus means to become. We often say that we are entogignesthè, which implies the process of a continuous becoming or the constant birth of being. Heraclitus, who is believed to have been born in Ephesus in approximately 535 BC, was a pre-Socratic philosopher who was also called the Obscure due to the paradoxical nature of his philosophy. He is famous for a number of quotes which exemplify his basic belief in the ever-present change. Some such quotes are, "There is nothing permanent except change," "Everything flows, nothing stands still," "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man." These quotes are just some pointers towards the direction I would like to bring to our discussion today. Today, we stand here in the midst of a pandemic that has shaken the whole world and is rapidly changing our everyday way of being in the world. How we are changing and what these changes will bring is probably too early to say. But one thing is obvious in my mind. We are all forced to see and experience the fluidity, uncertainty, and fragility of life. We are forced to be aware of the impermanence of life and of the effect that our actions have on nature, others, and the world we live in. It is hard to deny the ever-present threat of death and the importance of our connection to others. Most of the people I see in my private practice have experienced the lockdown as a growth-enhancing experience. They realized how few things they really needed, and that what they missed the most was contact with their friends and families. Many experienced the lockdown as an opportunity for intense inner work, and for some, our virtual sessions were often more powerful than our face-to-face meetings. For some, the period of isolation gave them a great push to deal with long-standing issues. Everything seemed to be under a magnifying lens. As I had presented in 2018 and was very excited to see printed in the last issue of the Humanistic Psychologist, thanatos, or the realization of death, is like a slap on our face that awakens us to the importance of life and of how we live life. Death awareness presents the danger of freezing and paralyzing us, but it is also an opportunity for increased distros, for grabbing every moment of our life as if it is the last one and making the best possible out of it. The realization of the fluidity and impermanence of our life creates the existential anxiety described by Kierkegaard, Rollo May, and many other philosophers and therapists that is also referred to as angst. This angst or agony is a gadfly that keeps us aware of the importance of life and of the now. It can help us live not only in a more intense and fulfilling manner, but also with greater authenticity. Although we are in a constant flow and process of becoming, creating ourselves every day and evolving into the being we are today, we each recognize ourselves as Eugenia or Eric or Will and so on. We have a sense of continuity and sameness that we experience as stable. And it is only at certain times, usually of contemplation, that we realize how much we have changed over time. I often think of this paradox as is our experience of the earth. Our planet Earth is constantly revolving around its axis and around the sun, and is never still. However, we experience the ground as stable and unmovable. If we were to be feeling the constant movement, we would be dizzy and unable to stand up, as is our experience of being in a ship on a turbulent sea. Similarly, human beings need to feel stable and safe in order to stand up, be functional, and not experience the dizziness of life. This feeling of stability in the midst of constant flow is the result of our ability to regulate our affect and our self-state. We now know from neurobiological research and from affect regulation theories that this ability for self-regulation and basic sense of trust and security in our world and in others is linked to early attachment patterns. Our primary relationship with mother or with caregiver is very important for our ability to regulate our affective states and thus to be able to maintain a certain balance in the midst of turmoil. In an existential developmental model of therapy that has been evolving in my mind since I was a student, the notion of Erikson's basic trust and the safe bond of Bowlby seem to represent not only a desirable and helpful start for our adventure in life, but also the basic building block of the therapeutic alliance. As is often mentioned, and as research findings suggest, it is the relationship that heals. It is the establishment of a trusting and caring connection that allows the person in therapy to reclaim his or her real self, as Paul Stern writes in his book, In Praise of Madness. The therapeutic relationship creates a new experience of relating with another and offers this corrective emotional experience that Franz Alexander had suggested. It serves as a new prototype for regulating our affect and self-state. A young woman I used to see for approximately 7 years offered me a letter on our termination date. She wrote, "Initially, I want to thank you for the biggest and most important thing you helped me acquire, myself. I feel I am. I feel who I am in the years of my life. I have me with me all the time. I can see me through my eyes, and I can feel proud of me and compassion for me. This is the greatest present for me, and I have achieved it mainly through our work and our relationship. I feel that no matter what happens, I will have at least me, although I'm very scared of what life will bring. Because of this feeling of being me, the continuous agony and anxiety I experienced since I was a child is gone. Now it comes and goes like everything else. I can stay by myself, I can be with others, I can enjoy. I can be in the present, in the now, in the relationship, and especially in the relationship with myself." Eric read in his article, Sanctuary and Presence, an existential view of the therapist's contribution, brings to our attention two elements of psychotherapy, the environment and the person of the therapist, that are of utmost importance. The therapist is responsible for creating and maintaining a safe space, the sanctuary, in which this new experience will be born. For the creation of this avatar, as it was referred in ancient Greece in the healing temples of Asclepios, the elements of privacy, confidentiality, and sacredness are essential. The person who comes to therapy is in a vulnerable position and needs to feel safe and nested in order to open up his or her world to the therapist and have the opportunity to experience compassion and understanding. The person of the therapist creates not only the holding environment in which the relationship is experienced, but also what Eric Craig refers to as disciplined original presence. The therapist's way of being there with the other in a consistent, caring, respectful, and non-judgmental manner is important. The person in therapy needs to experience the open, phenomenologically curious glance of the therapist in order to unravel his or her life story. This leads to an increased openness towards life, others, and the world of possibilities. As a young man I used to see in therapy told me in our closing session, "Your non-imposing presence gave me the space to flourish." Thank you for your attention. I hope we will have the opportunity to further discuss these important issues, not only for existential therapy, but for all forms of psychotherapy.
Thank you, Evgenia. Wonderful presentation, very thought-provoking. I am the next presenter. My name is Will Wadlington. I'm retired from the Counseling Center at Penn State, and also recently, the end of last year, retired from private practice. I feel very privileged to be here with these very distinguished practitioners today. My presentation is on self-knowledge and self-creation in existential psychotherapy. Now, there are a lot of words in my presentation, but all of them are available in a handout, so don't worry about taking notes. These are very broad and deep topics. I'll talk for about 5 minutes on each of these topics. Now, I decided if I'm going to talk about self-knowledge, I better start with myself and some things I know about myself. This is the book I wish I'd read before attending graduate school in psychology. Before graduate school, my training and experience was in fine arts, but I already suspected that psychology was overly identified with science, that it justified itself as science. But I was fortunate. I found some teachers who were interested in the philosophy of science. They were questioning justificationism in psychology. Methodolatry was criticized, and non-Cartesian thinking was actually encouraged. But I hadn't yet read Rank, who in this book was attempting, like Buehler and Vygotsky, to develop a critical psychology of subjectivity. This is Rank on two kinds of psychology: self-awareness and the study of others. Seeing this was an epiphany for me. I'd been so unconsciously influenced by the belief system of conventional American psychological science, it actually escaped me that self-awareness was a legitimate practice for psychologists. Now, I knew that self-awareness could be used as an independent variable. For example, we could study mindfulness. In graduate school, I studied meditation and hypnosis, for example. But practicing self-awareness, that seemed like something discredited, like introspection. Here's Otto Rank as a young man. Who is he? He's an early psychoanalyst, the first lay analyst, non-medical analyst. Rank was a self-aware young man who Freud chose for his wealth of knowledge of myth, Western philosophy, and art. Rank brought depth to psychoanalysis. He was closest to Freud for 20 years, but went his own way at age 40. Freud, who analyzed himself, thought Rank was well qualified as an analyst, as good as any, he said of Rank. When Rank tried to develop psychoanalysis further in an existential, experiential direction, Rank went through his own trauma of birth, becoming an independent psychological thinker and his own kind of psychotherapist. Freud then thought Rank needed to be analyzed. Rank seems prescient. He was talking about these ideas in the 20s and 30s. He developed a psychology, a practice, and an approach to life. Rank was interested in ideology. Ideologies are systems of belief that hold sway over us, influence us. They're what we take for granted. This is before Kuhn's notion of paradigms, and it's well before constructivist ideas about idolatry. Rank understood the power dynamics of ideological systems firsthand, as he separated from psychoanalysis, a movement that for him had become petrified and dogmatic. One of Rank's major contributions to a self-aware psychology was his emphasis on how ideologies shape knowledge, even our knowledge of our own death. One of the first ideologies, according to Rank, is the belief in immortality in the face of undeniable death. Most know Rank through Ernest Becker's denial of death. Rank spoke of the need to confront and not deny the inevitability of our own death, our mortality, and the importance of doing so in order to more fully live. Rank talked about death fear, not death drive, but death fear. And Rank thought suppressing oneself, inhibiting oneself, was an attempt to bribe death with unlived life. This is an older Rank in this photo. Along with his colleague Sándor Ferenczi, the two were the first to study the psychotherapeutic experience in the here and now. Erlebnis therapy, they called it. Erlebnis is experience. This developed out of Erlebnis therapy. Rank's is more an approach than a technique or a procedure. It's an active process. It's experiential psychotherapy, not psychoanalysis. Needless to say, there could be no manual of Rankian therapy. But what is the soul? What a strange title for a book on psychology. Jim Lieberman, who co-translated this latest version of the book that was originally written in 1930, said the soul was created in the Big Bang of an irresistible psychological force, our will to live forever colliding with the immutable biological fact of death. Our aliveness requires a recognition of our mortality. When we're not suffering, we might even delight in life. And of course, we want to live forever. But our sense of ourselves changes with changing ideologies about life and death. Just let me live a little bit longer. Or let me get to the next life. Rank said science excluded the soul and left it to philosophy. Although in psychoanalysis and archetypal psychology, the soul morphed into the unconscious. Did the soul evolve into the self? I think that's an important psychohistorical question. But the soul may be outside our knowing, outside our ken. Freud and Rank both studied the uncanny. Freud described the startled feeling expressed in, "So, the dead do live?" And Rank famously wrote about the doppelganger, or double. Rank thought the appearance of the dead in dreams was experienced as proof of a soul that lives beyond death. But back to the self. Well, this is tricky. Things can become too concrete. I want to move from conceiving the self as a concept or entity, a thing, and toward a more phenomenological description of being a self. There's so many ways to think and talk about the self. I'm going to consider only a very few examples. What we take to be a self is tentative, fictitious, constructed by clinging, a temporary identification with some part of experience. This is recognizable in many contemplative practices. The self or ego is not a substantial entity. This self is ephemeral, a comforting illusion that we can let go of. But in the Western tradition, the one Rank was trained in, there's a different conception. The body without breath is dead, but the soul is free and still lives. I can't read this without thinking of the powerful statement, I can't breathe. Death is real. It can't be denied. But there's a belief that the soul is immortal. Death is real for mortals. All this talk of immortality and immortal beings, that's a denial of the reality of death. Acknowledging death is the act of a mortal soul or self. Obviously, I can't cover all of these topics, but I think Western philosophy is a manifestation of an indigenous wisdom tradition in the ancient world. This is the second time today the name Heraclitus has been invoked, twice in one program at APA. Heraclitus is right now turning over in his grave. What a strange, uncanny expression. We find the earliest reflections on self-knowledge in Heraclitus, who also knew and spoke about Delphi, the inscriptions on the Temple of Apollo, at the navel of the world, where one consults the oracle. I regard pre-Socratic thought as indigenous wisdom. Know thyself is unintelligible apart from the second Delphic inscription, nothing too much, which is the opposite of arrogance. I think Sophrosune is similar to what's called epistemic humility. It's an appreciation for the limits of our knowledge. There's always more we don't know about ourselves. And awareness of how little we know is the path to further, deeper knowing. We regard Socrates as a Western exemplar of self-examination, openness to scrutiny and refutation. He acknowledges his ignorance, the limitations of his knowledge. He engages in irony and dialectic in order to appreciate things from both his own side and the other side. And he attempts to avoid self-deception. We think of Socrates as a person of integrity. Socrates says, "It seems necessary to me to consider yet again what I even mean. For one being deceived by oneself is the worst thing of all. There are risks in self-knowledge." But getting back to Rank, as he points out, there are also resistances. Rank says, deep down, we don't want to observe ourselves and increase self-knowledge. The search for self-knowledge is not an original part of our nature. It's painful. It doesn't always help. It's often disturbing. This again is in Psychology and the Soul by Rank. Here he offers an ironic perspective. Do we really want to know ourselves? But what about self-creation? All of these seem necessary. We need accurate mirroring. We need play, including play at being other than who we are. And we engage with a therapist or an intimate other in a process of forming and shaping a new self. Nietzsche talked about giving style to one's character. Nietzsche also said, "We all wish to be poets of our lives, but poetry is best spoken and received. All of these are relational. You show me who I am, you engage with me in trying out new versions of myself, and you collaborate with me in reinventing myself." Rank said, "We are all potentially artist types, creators as well as creatures." The metaphor of midwifery occurs in the dialogues of Socrates. Rank was very familiar with these dialogues. Rank says Socrates himself likened his dialectic therapy of drawing forth thoughts to the practice of midwifery, as he practices it in imitation of his mother, who was a midwife. Socrates' mother was a midwife. Socrates says, "My concern is not with the body, but with the soul that is in travail of birth." Some of my speculation about the self in therapy. Awareness of self is letting go of self-consciousness. Self-knowledge requires authenticity and integrity. Self-creation is beautifully expressed by Lieberman and Kramer, who said, "By willing to be oneself within a relationship, by accepting and affirming one's difference and having it accepted by another, the client discovers or recovers the creative ability to change." How does this happen in a Rankian approach to therapy? Rank once joked that he needed a new theory for each client. Anais Nin, the famous autobiographer, was a patient of Rank. She remarked on his spontaneity, his darting opportunism. Rank's opportunism was his openness to the unexpected and his interest in seizing opportunities here and now rather than gathering data to support a later interpretation. I've spoken before about components of the therapeutic relationship. Present-centered awareness in therapy helps bring the client back to full engagement with reality, to spontaneity and aliveness, to the moment, to the flow of life. Jesse Taft said therapy with Rank was learning to flow with life. Therapy works experientially. Our time together is limited, just as life is limited by death. This is an invitation to live fully and expressively. It's a different way of being with one another. This art of living can occur in any relationship. It occurs sometimes unbidden in therapy. It's not predictable. We need to be open and receptive to it. When I use the word art, I'm not referring to a method or technique, but rather to the experience of being alive that can occur in psychotherapy and elsewhere. What I'm calling an art of living is an experience many of us share. It's recognizable, knowable, although usually implicit. So these are the topics I discussed today. Just to summarize, Rank's ideas on soul and immortality beliefs were informed by his deep understanding of the mythic and philosophic traditions in the West. And he developed a practice based on his assumption that we're all capable of self-awareness, self-knowledge, and self-creation. Much more could be said, but let's leave it at that. Thank you. President of the Existential Humanistic Institute, past president of the Society for Humanistic Psychology, adjunct faculty member at Saybrook University and Teachers College, Columbia University. Kirk is the author of a number of books, important books, And he's doing work now on helping people overcome polarized communication. This is such important work and so timely. I've known Kirk for a long time, and I'm very pleased he has decided to run for president of APA. The time is right. Kirk.
Thank you so much, Will. And thank you to everyone here. It's wonderful to be back together again in this depth psychological spirit that you all so profoundly embody. Well, I'm not going to do a great deal of critiquing today. As you can imagine, I resonate to so many of the points that you've all made. I think what I'm going to do more of is underscoring key points that really struck me. And also to point us to, I think, a woefully neglected dimension of our field. And that is what you've all brought out so eloquently in terms of the philosophical underpinnings of our entire field, certainly the field of psychotherapy. I think this can't be brought out enough, and you all have done a wonderful job of helping to make more explicit the foundations upon which all the bona fide therapies really draw, for their effectiveness. So I'm going to sort of keep that as a context as I go through these points, as well as maybe a broader social context for your remarks. So just very briefly, to begin with Eric's reflection, wonderful reflection on presence. And as I've mentioned Eric in the past, I've long been extremely appreciative of his concept of presence as sanctuary. For me, that really brings alive the power of the concept, the sensibility of presence on so many levels. Certainly what you home in on is a place of safety and freedom. So significant, Eric. How many places do we have in our day-to-day world where people feel that sense of safety and freedom, and particularly inner freedom within which to roam and to range, the good, the bad, and the ugly, so to speak. But I like to say the whole enchilada, mind, body, spirit, our vulnerability, our fragility, which is so integral to our humanity, as well as our capacity to venture out, to take risks, to create, and to do that right there with our partner, our healer. So I also was struck by what you said about presence as the heart of philosophy, and that certainly makes a lot of sense in terms of thinking about, one of the cradles of philosophy, the Socratic and Platonic forums of ancient Greece, and thinking of Evgenia here as well. The capacity to wonder, to inquire as to the meaningful things in life. That is core. I'd like to just add, though, that I think that it's not only at the heart of philosophy, it's at the heart of artistry, and indeed life. So, certainly Will brought this out with Otto Rank's work, Evgenia with Aestris, and you bring it out in your own way, Eric, in your presentation. But it's at the heart of so much of our experience if we only paid attention and attuned more deeply. I love what you said about presence as a way of being and being as a miracle. I often like to allude to the concept of miracle as well, without necessarily putting religious connotations on it. Why should we? I mean, it is the fact that we are, and the trajectory toward the radically unknown are both miracles, and we just don't know. I'm thinking of Will talking about Otto Rank here as well, in terms of the afterlife. Yeah, I mean, he's holding the uncanniness of it. Also, presence and relationship as immeasurables. I think this is an important learning for contemporary traditional psychology. Again, I think this is a very important place for the qualitative dimension of our work, and how qualitative inquiry can be so important as a complement to quantitative inquiry in the areas of psychotherapy effectiveness, where we can't so much measure these sensibilities, variables, but we can certainly describe them quite deeply, and even bring metaphors to bear that help us to excavate them. So I just want to conclude that so much of what you say about presence reminds me of the power of that dimension for social healing as well. I mean, you bring out Buber, Kierkegaard, but I'd say Buber even more in terms of the social implication of presence. And this is, as Will alluded to earlier, something that I've been very immersed in increasingly around my work with what I call the experiential democracy dialogue, which draws in part from my experience with a grassroots organization called Braver Angels, which brings liberals, self-identified liberals and conservatives together for living room style dialogues, not in the service of trying to change others' minds. It's very phenomenological, and I think this is what tunes into all of your talks. It's very much about attempting to learn about and understand the other with the prospect, and I'd say increased likelihood, of achieving common ground through that discovery process, especially the discovery of the humanity of the other, as opposed to these simplistic stereotypes and labels that we get from media often and from political circles. So what happens when we really sit down and just engage with each other? I think that act alone, as we see in psychotherapy, can be so beneficial in terms of helping people to bring out the more of who they are, and that sense of a living experience, as Evgenia so beautifully talked about, the sense of becoming. And I mean, I'd say most people, if not all people, are in this state of becoming. We certainly get stuck in our ways, but one of the most healing ways of living is to be able to acknowledge that, and to find connections within that becoming, within ourselves and with others. So on to Evgenia. Istros, I've long deeply valued that sensibility, and really appreciate that you brought that out. And as I said in Greece even, I feel like the Greek philosophers did cover just about everything. As I got to know more about Greek philosophy, I mean, it is so reminiscent of, aspects of Eastern philosophy, Taoism, Buddhism, and certainly Heraclitus's notion of a flow of becoming, not stepping in the same river twice, and not being the same person who steps in the river twice. These could all be related to Taoistic principles, certainly. But that whole notion of, covering the fuller ranges of our experience, I love that. And of course, that's something I've been immersed in as well, the valuing of the paradoxes of our lives. The fact that we are, these small, fragile, vulnerable creatures before the vastness of creation. But at the very same time, creatures capable of tremendous transcendence and creation, and a sense of participation in something much greater than ourselves, which is the fount of great philosophy and religiosity, I would say, spirituality. So I like what you say about finding, in my words, finding ground within groundlessness. I think this is a really important implication of that pre-Socratic thought and Heraclitus that is very valuable for us. And I think that that comes out of some of our most effective therapy, where the person feels that they can range within and be present to very difficult places within themselves, and places that feel very groundless and without support, and yet be okay with a lot of those places within themselves, and find some sort of landing areas that hold a much greater range of aliveness, capacity for thoughts, feelings, body sensations, imaginings. I'm reminded of a client of mine a while back who talked about focusing on being scared without being afraid. That was a very powerful statement, I thought, about moving forward in her life. And much of her quest was about finding greater freedom in her life to respond, especially to loved ones in her life. But she had to find that within first. And that was very difficult because of the great trauma that she had gone through as a child. So I guess I should move on to Will's presentation. I'm continually inspired when I hear about the depth perspective of Otto Rank and your exquisite explication of Rank. I like how you began with yourself and your own subjectivity, and how that brought you to recognize the importance of subjectivity in psychology and therapy, and Rank's psychology of the soul. I liked a number of the points that you made, for example, that intimacy is not reducible to transference. This is something that we could perhaps have a much deeper dialogue about with our psychoanalytic sisters and brothers. But just how psychotherapy has emerged generally in some reductionistic modes. Recognizing that we're full human beings here with each other, and again, not just categories that can be reduced to specific periods or figures in our backgrounds. We're more than that, and we bring more than that to each other, which is often not easily measured. Sense of shared aliveness, creativity of therapy, the spontaneity. It's not just a technique. It's not a solo act of the therapist, but a spontaneous improvisational duet. Beautifully said. A kind of a dance that involves a co-presencing and a co-relation. Rank, again, so prescient in his perspective on these things. Sense of the moment as unique, new, and decisive. Yes, how important that is. And again, reflecting back to some of the things Eric said about, the common factors, the contextual factors. This is so key. We need to be attuned to the moment with our clients if we're going to engage in a collaborative relationship, right? And collaboration is one of the common factors, contextual factors. And certainly we need that attunement to the moment for empathy, for an alliance and connection with the client, for genuineness with the client. All important contextual factors. Experience of intimacy, again, powerful contextual factor. And then, of course, there's all the things that Ronk said philosophically, which, again, are so important for our historical understanding of psychology and psychotherapy, our awareness of our assumptions that go into these, scientific paradigms that we've adopted. And again, we're really talking about the underpinnings, getting to the foundational aspects of psychology and psychotherapy with these perspectives. I just maybe conclude with a statement by Bruce Wampold, one of our leading psychotherapy researchers, who talked about how, an understanding of the existential underpinnings of psychotherapy may well be, basically requirements for all bona fide psychotherapists. And I think that's quite a statement about how psychotherapy and perhaps psychology really is moving toward a more integrative and whole person understanding of the human being. And I think this is where existential psychology really shines and gives us a great deal of information and awareness about what is optimally healing for individuals as well as our society. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kurt.
Very welcome.
Thank you very much.
Very nice. Yeah.
Well, we're great. Are we still recording at this point?
I believe so.
Yes.
This is a chance for us to talk among ourselves, a chance
Yes.
for us to respond to one another. It's so nice to see you all and be here with you.
You too.
My sense is that we're in a process of becoming in the process of recording this presentation. That we're closer to one another now than when we began, and more connected. I can really feel that.
I do too.
I'm struck by the commonality of the questions and the fundamental nature of the questions that underline all four of us. Evgenia, Will, Kirk, myself, all four of us were addressing questions like, what is it to be? What is it to be a self? What is it to be? What is it to be present with another? And of course, what is the nature of the other? Is the other really other? And what is it to be present? And what is it to be in the moment? I mean, these are all, very underlying characteristics of our being as therapists. This thing that we all do and means so much to us.
Yeah, and I would just add, and what is the healing element of that presence to ourselves, to others? What do we mean by healing?
Oh, yeah. And is psychotherapy all about healing? Or is it also, because many people, once they feel they've gone through their basic conflicts and sources of pain, they want to do the Socratic thing. What is this thing, a human life? What am I here for? How do I deal with love and existence and the inevitability or the law of impermanence that so many of you have talked about? The Buddhists call it the law of impermanence, not just change and becoming, but it's the law of impermanence. It's the one thing that doesn't change is change.
With regard to this issue of healing, I was struck in Ronk's description of Socrates' work, his dialectic. Ronk called that Socrates' therapy, a therapy of drawing forth thoughts. So it kind of resonates with what you're saying, Eric, that when we engage in real conversation with one another, real connection, real dialectic with one another, that it's intrinsically therapeutic.
Yeah.
I don't know if healing is the word to describe that, but helpful, healthful maybe.
Yeah. Bugental talked, he was the first person I heard say this, which I really liked, about psychotherapy as a process that if people are really engaged in that process, they move from the psychological healing so-called dimension to the ontological dimension, to the being.
It's an embodied sensibility too. I mean, I think maybe we can even feel it right now. As Will was saying, we're moving closer to each other through this process. And I feel some kind of bodily shift in warmth and flow. It's hard to put words to it exactly. It's a whole body feeling.
A whole body, yeah. Though I must say I miss the body. Just being able to put my hand on your shoulder.
Well, isn't that ironic that I'm experiencing that through an 11-inch wafer here? Yeah. But I think this is something we're going to need to contend with as we get on with our future. This may be more of the sort of the face of psychotherapy, and maybe even intensive psychotherapy.
It's true.
So,
Kenya,
big
what's
question.
going on there? You're silent. I'm wondering if you.
Yes. I'd like to hear.
Well, I'm listening to all three of you. It's very heart-touching that we are able to connect from so far away. And it always is nice to hear you speaking. So I prefer to hear rather than to speak. But I was thinking about the healing. And when you said about the embodied part, Kirk, I thought about the healing in the body. That is different. I mean, probably the body heals, but the soul or the psyche or the self, I don't know if it is exactly the same way of healing, or it is more a sort of an acceptance of life, more like being at peace with oneself, or reaching a certain level of integration and peacefulness.
Yes.
We call healing. So the two different ways of healing, the healing of the body and the healing of the self. So that was the thought that came to my mind by listening to you.
Resonates for me, for sure. What strikes me is we're almost doing a kind of phenomenology of healing right now, bringing out these various descriptors of what we're experiencing.
Yeah, something I didn't say, but I had a thought last night, and this goes back to presence, and I'm experiencing it here. We all are present when we come into the world. Everybody's present. What that means and how we're present is the question, of course, and how we're present therapeutically is the question. But presencing is a coming into a being and a kind of openness, and our presencing actually right here with one another presences. In other words, as you are present, let's say, Kirk, you're present to me right now. This invites my presencing. It's the presencing of presence. It's not just I'm present, but when I'm present, I invite the presence of, not just each of you, which I'm actually experiencing, but also the trees outside, the world, really. We invite the presence of whatever it is, as Buber says, whatever encounters us. Our presence invites presence, the presencing of presence. So that came to me in the middle of the night tonight. But I'm experiencing it here with each of the three of you. So.
Sounds like kind of an openness and receptivity.
Yeah.
Allowing things to affect us. I want to raise a question. I heard Kirk use the word sensibility several times. And one of my reactions to that was thinking about artistic sensibility, which seems to me is kind of an older term that may have kind of elitist connotations. In other words, I have an aesthetic sensibility and you don't. And if you're lucky, maybe you could develop it. But I suspect that you're using sensibility to describe more a fuller, more complete phenomenological experience that includes sensing, feeling, and thinking. That's very, as you said, holistic.
Exactly.
So just wanted to clarify, how are you thinking of sensibility?
And I'm sorry that it comes across with that connotation. I didn't even
I don't think it comes across that way. Those are just old associations I have.
Associations, and I'm sure others have similar associations. Yeah, but I have really come around to thinking of that term in a much more holistic ways, as you were describing, as a kind of whole body experience. And I like using it more often because I think we get overly stuck in some of these sort of scientific terms like factors. So the contextual factors, certainly a helpful way of describing what we call common factors, often in psychotherapy. And it can relate to a certain approach to research, but I purposely want to bring in the notion of what you suggested earlier about some of the immeasurables, or let's say non-quantifiables. They still can be gauges of some kind of what's going on, but much harder to reduce to units or numbers. So yeah, sensibility for me is a richer, rounder way of describing, my empathy for you, or my sense of connection with you right now, or a feeling that I'm picking up about what's going on between us. Yeah.
Yeah, I like the
I
ground.
think there's a different sense of description that comes up when I think of a more scientific use of description. I think description sometimes is used as a preliminary to understanding and explaining a phenomenon, and maybe ultimately to controlling, having some impact on that phenomenon. But when we're talking about describing today and trying, I think that's what we're doing right now, is trying really hard to describe a connection between each other, connection within. We're trying to describe sensations, thoughts and feelings that are coming up for us. But it's more, I want to say, like, it's purer, it's powerful in itself, just to monitor what's going on and use simple language to describe it right now. It's not loaded with all that baggage of, what's the use of it? What's the use of describing? What's the purpose? There's a richness to description,
Yes.
independent of its use, is what I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I would say something like that. Basically, the description, it's words, and words or language give presence to being, give being the invitation to be. It brings the language brings being into being, really, for us to experience and engage and contend with sometimes. But
Yeah, and I like what you say about invitational, the invitational aspect, presence,
Right.
an inviting mode that again seems like an underpinning for our work. I just want to say quickly, I don't want to dichotomize this too much either. I don't see it as an either or. I do think there's a definite place for being purposeful about this work at times, and for measurement or certain more maybe instructive modes that we may get into, advisory modes that we may get into for people, let's say, in dire situations. They're being beaten by their husband. Is that a place for fuller internal exploration, or is that perhaps a place to suggest a woman's shelter? right now. You know,
Intervention, right?
intervention, yes. You know, or somebody being overwhelmed by feelings. There may be forms of containment that would be important that
You're adding,
feel covered.
yeah, you're adding something, but it's very important, Kirk, what you're saying. You know, that we not only have anticipatory care, which we've all been talking about mostly, and you're saying, well, there is a time for action. There is a time for intervention when it's called for.
And I think our presence can inform that time as well. So the more attuned we are to the relationship, the better guidance we have, you know, for those more interventional modes. Yeah.
Right. It's tough though to trust the presence, your presence, the relationship itself, to inform those critical moments, as opposed to the standards and rules of the ethics code. You know, this is this person and myself, and we've got to. This is what we've got to use to account for it. And so often we are so concerned about what we're told we're supposed to be doing instead of what the relationship, the immediate moment tells us. I think that's what you're describing as the kind of intervention.
Right. Again, not splitting so much.
Right. Exactly.
More of a wholeness to the process.
Evgenia is wanting to say something, I'm sure.
Well, actually, what I wanted to say was that, you know, beyond description and beyond words is also how we experience each other and how we experience what is happening worldwide right now. So, you know, I have these mixed feelings that on one level, we're here discussing very important issues for psychotherapy. And on another level, there is so much turmoil happening everywhere. And my thought is that we're trying, or that's how it's in my mind, that we're trying to improve the world, but the world seems to be getting more in trouble somehow. And this is
How does that affect you?
this is causing a little bit of frustration for me in that, and a little bit of disappointment in that. Although I'm a very optimistic person, I'm slowly losing my hopeful outlook on being, on humanity, on humans, and what we're all doing to each other and to the world and to animals. And
Do you have some thoughts about how you can impact that, or is that even in your consciousness?
well, I hope that you know, by raising awareness and by becoming more self-knowledgeable, like what is on the Delphi, know thyself, and by realizing that we are all in the same boat and that there is nothing really to share, or there are a lot of things to share, but if we destroy the planet, there will be nothing to share. I don't know what's the solution. I think that, you know, what you're doing, Kirk, and trying to raise awareness in terms of the polarized mind, and each in our own little niche, trying to do the best that we can. But there seems to be so many outside influences that are discouraging me, at least. And it seems like a tremendous fit to be able to undo the harm that we have already been doing.
Evgenia, I think you're bringing some stability, some of the stability that you talked about back to this revolving planet with all the confusion, contradiction, uncertainty. Just hearing your voice is soothing and stabilizing, centering. As you speak about your experience, it's very powerful.
Very calming presence. What you're doing, Kirk, in that regard about bringing that groups, you mentioned it a couple times when I've been with you, and that just sounds like an extraordinary action on your part, concrete and essential.
Thank you. I mean, I do see it as a natural outgrowth of the work we're doing in many ways. And it does hark back to the core of presence. How do we cultivate greater presence to each other as whole human beings? And to Evgenia's point, how do we keep the hope of that in the midst of all that we're seeing today? I guess for me, it's a kind of therapy to be a part of these groups and, engage in further thinking about development of these processes.
Interesting. I had a client yesterday who's she's 82 years old, and all her friends are whom she's kept over the years. They're now spread over the country, but they all happen to be Republicans and in favor of Trump, and they're always talking about the awful black people and these kinds of things. And she just says, well, let's not talk about those things. But yesterday I said, why not just bring this difference out in the open? Something like, wow, sometimes when you talk about these things, I think it feels to me like I'm an earthling and you're a Martian. And then when I talk about how I feel, you probably feel like you're the earthling and I'm the Martian. And yet here we are still loving and caring and staying in relation to one another. And if we could get to that place.
Because these things so quickly devolve into food fights or worse, flamethrower. We all know how quickly it devolves.
Yeah.
And that's why I think highly supportive and structured formats for these dialogues is key. Because part of the problem of the past with conflict mediation is we threw people into debates or encounters without really priming them in terms of their humanity, centering oneself in what it might be like to sit with this person, what feelings come up, thoughts, and can you make a space for the humanity of this other through all the labels, and then having the folks talk about their backgrounds. What was it like to grow up? Trying to get a sense of the person.
Right.
And how did your family treat others?
As fellow citizens of the planet.
Persons. Yeah.
But I want to bring all of this to a conclusion and thank each and every one of you who are viewing this symposium. Thank you for attending, and thank you for paying close attention to what we've been saying. And you may have comments or questions or remarks. We will be available on the Discuss, DISQUS platform to respond to you. We will get emails when you put something on that, a question or comment on that platform. For now, we need to wrap up. And I want to express my deep thanks to Evgenia, Eric, and Kirk. I feel so grateful to the three of you for your presence here today with me. Thank you very much.
Likewise.
And goodbye.
Thank you, Will, for
Thank you.
pulling this together.
Thank you.
Oh.